I woke up to the sound of rain hitting the tin roof, each drop sharp enough to cut through the cold that already lived in my bones. The small space smelled like damp wood and rust. My breath fogged the air in front of me, and for a second I thought I was dreaming. Until I reached out and my fingers touched the rough plywood wall of the shed. My shed. My son's idea of temporary housing. Before we continue, make sure to hit the like button. Also tell us in the comments. What time is it where you are right now, and which city are you watching from? I love seeing how far our stories travel. I sat up slowly, knees cracking like old wiring snapping loose from a panel. The thin blanket slid off my shoulders and landed on the cold floor. My coffee thermos sat empty beside the cot. I'd finished it hours ago, sometime around 3 in the morning, when the wind started clawing at the door and the shed creaked like a tired ship. A week ago I slept in a real bed, my bed, a room with walls I built myself back when the house was still mine in more than name. The mortgage was paid, every nail driven by my hand. Now that same house glowed warm across the yard, the kitchen window spilling yellow light through the rain. My son and his wife were awake, laughing about something, music faint under the sound of thunder. I could smell bacon. They called it downsizing. Said the main rooms were too crowded, that the house needed a new flow. I'd nodded like an old fool who'd forgotten the weight of his own silence. They told me the shed would be temporary, a place to rest while they renovated the guest room. It had been 7 nights. 7 long, frozen, humiliating nights. I reached for the little lantern I kept by the cot and turned it on. The weak bulb flickered, sputtered, then steadied. It wasn't much, but it let me see the condensation dripping down the window pane and the small space heater in the corner. Unplugged since yesterday. They said it was tripping the breaker, said I was using too much electricity. I'd smiled then, hiding the sting. I used to be an electrician. I'd wired that whole house myself before my son was even born. Every outlet, every fuse, every hidden run behind the drywall. They were as familiar to me as the veins in my own hands. I wrapped my coat tighter and looked at the rain through the cracked glass. The reflection stared back. A 78-year-old man with tired eyes and a face that still carried traces of who he'd been. Provider, builder, father. Now just a quiet man in a shed. The first few nights I told myself it was fine. I'd been through worse storms. I told myself they were just adjusting, that maybe they didn't realize how hard the nights could get. But then the laughter started carrying through the window. The dinners I wasn't invited to. The sound of their friends arriving in cars that parked where my truck used to sit. And then last night, the final sting. I'd knocked on the back door just after sunset, holding my empty thermos. I asked if I could fill it with some hot water. My daughter-in-law looked at me the way people look at a stray dog. She said they were in the middle of something and closed the door before I could finish my sentence. Through the glass, I saw my son shrug. "He's fine," he said. "He likes his privacy." Privacy. That word echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. The kind of privacy you give to someone you've already forgotten exists. Now in the weak morning light, I sat there listening to the hum of their furnace through the wall, knowing they were warm while my fingers turned numb. And yet, in that cold, something started to change. The quiet settled differently. Less like surrender, more like understanding. There's a certain moment when a man's pride breaks clean. Not shattered, not scattered, just clean. When you stop fighting for their approval and start remembering who you were before they decided who you should be. I'd spent my whole life fixing other people's problems, rewiring things that didn't work. Maybe it was time I fixed something of my own. The rain eased. The sky lightened to a dull gray. From inside the house, I heard my son laughing again, a big careless sound that didn't belong to the boy I raised. It belonged to someone who'd forgotten what it cost to build that home in the first place. I stood up, slow but steady, my back straightening against the years. The shed's single bulb flickered again, and for a second I thought of turning it off to save power. But then I smiled, a small, tired smile, and left it burning. Power was something I'd always understood better than anyone else in that house. Maybe it was time they remembered that. The first thing I did after breakfast, black coffee from a thermos, cold but steady, was make a list. Not the kind of list that begs for forgiveness or explanation, but the kind that a man who's spent his life on job sites makes when a problem needs solving. Measurements, materials, dates. I wrote everything down on a torn page from a legal pad I kept in my jacket pocket. Date, time, heater unplugged November 8th. Guest car in driveway November 9th, 9:12 p.m. Laughter heard through kitchen vent November 9th, 9:15 p.m. The list read like a blueprint of discomfort, plain and deliberate. It steadied me in the way the smell of sawdust used to steady me before I measured twice and cut once. You learn to observe when you've spent decades listening to motors and interpreting the language of machines. They tell you what they need in the small sounds they make. A fan's wobble, a breaker's faint tick. People, oddly enough, speak the same way. The small things they don't mean to hide, the casual access to your things, the way they leave doors unlocked for convenience but never for you, these were the whispering clues. I started keeping track, not out of spite, but because it made the world predictable again. Predictability is a kind of safety. That afternoon I walked the perimeter of the house like the old man I still was, the one who had poured concrete for the patio and sunk posts for the porch. I ran my hand along the siding, felt the joints where paint had chipped, noted the gutter that needed securing. The main breaker box sat on the side wall, half hidden behind a vine I'd planted years ago. I hadn't touched it since the renovation my son coordinated, but I knew it as well as I knew the lines of my hands. I leaned in and read the labels: kitchen, living room, furnace. My handwriting still faintly visible under dust, written long before they decided the house needed a new flow. It gave me a little private amusement to see their modern art prints hung on walls I'd wired. They'd redecorated the rooms but not the bones. The bones were mine. I started sleeping in shifts. Not because sleep had abandoned me, but because staying half awake let me catalog small patterns. What time they turned on the TV, which outlets clicked when the dishwasher cycled, the soft, indulgent music the daughter-in-law preferred on weekend mornings. I learned the rhythm of their lives the way I'd once learned the rhythm of a generator. You get an intimate knowledge of what keeps a place lit. That knowledge oddly made me feel a little less like a ghost, and more like a man who'd simply stepped off stage and was waiting for his cue. There were moments when my anger flickered quick as a short circuit. The first time I heard my son tell a friend, loud enough for the porch to hear, that Dad prefers the shed, he likes the solitude. My hands tightened on the thermos so hard my knuckles ached. The friend laughed, a sound like a loose hinge, and my son mimicked a gruff voice as he described me as old school. I turned my face to the rain and breathed through it. The temptation to march up the steps and demand what was mine flared like a faulty breaker. Sudden, bright, then gone. I'd learned the hard way that anger without plan is noise. Structure without mercy is the tool that fixes problems. So I made a plan. Not dramatic, not public. No confrontation at the dinner table where laughter would have drowned me out. My plan began with small things, quiet assessments and careful questions to myself about when the bills arrived, which account still carried my name, which appliances still had warranties under my files. I counted the days on my calendar, utilities, insurance, mortgage. I wrote down the dates when I'd given them the convenience of authorized access to accounts and the dates of purchases that didn't look like household needs. The numbers didn't make me furious so much as precise. I liked being precise. One evening, as a test, I unplugged the little heater in my shed and walked to the side of the house, pretending to sweep leaves from the walkway. My intention was simple. To feel the house from the outside, to catch how it sounded when the circuit shifted. I stood there with my hand on the railing and watched through the dining room window as the daughter-in-law flicked on the kettle and the lights came as if obeying some unseen conductor. She moved with that practiced host's ease, setting plates, adjusting candles, and my son opened a bottle of wine with the casual authority of someone who believed the place belonged to him. Habit pulled at me to step onto the porch and knock, to tell them what I felt, that the house had been built with my hands and my patience. Instead, I counted the hums. The fridge compressor kicked in, then the oven's glow began as she set a dish to heat. Small, normal things. I began to make small repairs from the shed, not to spite them and not to signal my presence, but because it helped restore my own sense of capability. I fixed a dripping tap at the outdoor spigot so I could have water without knocking. I mended a split in the shed's door frame with a carefully measured brace so I could sleep without the fear of wind-driven drafts. Each repair was a stitch in a life I was reclaiming quietly. Pride, when it's been unjustly taken, tastes like a warm socket after a long winter. At night I sat with my list and traced the lines between incidents, drawing connections I'd once drawn between wires on a plan. A at 9:12 p.m. connected to B at 9:15 p.m. The pattern emerged almost like a schematic. Convenience feeding entitlement, entitlement feeding disregard. The thought that nagged me, the one that kept me awake longer than the cold, was this: if you understand a system, you can change how it behaves. That had been true my whole working life. A well-placed breaker could cut power to the wrongdoer without damaging the rest of the house. A carefully closed circuit could make someone notice the absence of service. It was elegant in its simplicity and, I thought, just. I wasn't thinking about punishment in the movie's dramatic sense. I wasn't imagining grand vindication or some theatrically cruel moment. I was thinking about boundaries, about restoring the balance that had been tipped by thoughtless hands. The nights in the shed sharpened my resolve into something like craftsmanship. I felt oddly content, sober, methodical, crafting a solution as a man would craft a junction box, making sure each connection served its intended purpose and no stray wire would cause a short. In the quiet hours when the wind eased and the house was only the soft rhythm of sleeping appliances, I allowed myself a small pleasure, recalling the exact paths I'd run behind the drywall, the way I'd label a junction with my handwriting, the stubbornness of old insulation that clung like regret. I amused myself by imagining the light switches as decisions. Some I would leave to them. Others I would control until they learned to respect the layout. Knowledge, after all, is a kind of power, but knowledge wielded without malice and with the intent to correct. That felt fair. That night, as frost formed on the shed window and I sipped lukewarm coffee, I closed my pad and drew a final line beneath the day's notes. The line felt like a starting point. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll begin the small, deliberate work of reminding them who held the blueprints. I drifted towards sleep, not with the crumpled humiliation I'd carried those first nights, but with an engineer's calm. A plan laid out, a toolbox packed, a steady hand ready to turn a dial when needed. The house hummed on the other side of the yard, blissfully ignorant for now. That ignorance would, in time, be a lesson they couldn't ignore. I woke before dawn that Sunday the way men do who spent too many years answering alarms that came with storms and power failures. Even after retirement, the habit never left me. The shed was dark, The kind of dark that swallows shape and time, but I could tell by the chill that the night was almost over. There's a sound houses make right before daylight, a faint shift like breath returning, and I heard it from across the yard. I dressed in layers and stepped outside. The grass was stiff with frost. Each step cracked softly beneath my boots. From where I stood, I could see the back of the house glowing amber through the kitchen curtains. Someone had left the oven light on. Wasteful. But that was their way now. Waste and call it comfort. I carried my notebook with me. On the front page I had written one word: system. Everything else, the notes, the sketches, the lists, fed that heading. A system, once you understand it, can't betray you. It only follows the design you gave it. People, on the other hand, they'll rewire everything behind your back and still expect the lights to come on. The main breaker box waited where it always had, half hidden behind that vine. I brushed the leaves aside, their edges brittle in the cold. The metal door groaned when I opened it, but inside, inside, the circuits looked the same as the day I'd built them, neat rows labeled in my handwriting. The ink had faded to a brownish ghost, but it was mine. I ran a finger along the breakers. Each one represented a part of the house, a pulse point. I'd created a heart once, and now I could feel it beating under my fingertips. For a long time, I just stood there remembering. The first night after I wired the place, my wife had brought out 2 lawn chairs and a bottle of cheap wine. We sat under a single bulb hanging from a beam, and she'd said, "Feels alive, doesn't it?" I'd nodded. It had been alive because of work, not entitlement, because of gratitude. I could still hear her voice sometimes when I touched the panel. Maybe that's why I didn't cry. I'd already built the tears into the wiring long ago. By mid-morning, the house was awake. Music thumped through the walls, something electronic, repetitive. The daughter-in-law's voice drifted out the open kitchen window, high and light as she spoke into her phone about guests coming next weekend. I leaned my shoulder against the fence post and listened without meaning to. She said the words, big dinner, promotion, celebrate. I wondered what they'd celebrate, certainly not the man who paid off their mortgage. At noon, I saw them through the front window setting the table for friends. A line of wine glasses glittered in the sunlight. My son wore a new sweater, something sleek that didn't belong to our kind of men. He looked comfortable in it, comfortable in a way that comes only when you forget what effort feels like. They didn't see me watching. The guests arrived just after 1. Cars lined the curb, laughter spilled down the driveway. I went back into the shed not to hide, but to listen. From the crack beneath the door, I could see the faint reflection of their merriment. A flash of silverware, a shadow moving past the curtain. Then my name floated out between bursts of laughter. "Dad," my son said, his tone that false playfulness people use when cruelty wants to wear a joke's disguise. "Dad's out there tinkering. I swear he loves that shed more than his own room." Another voice joined, amused. "Is he really living out there?" A pause. Then my son again, louder. "He says it's fine. The old man likes it. Gives him something to do." The laughter that followed cracked something in me that didn't shatter but crystallized, clear and solid. It wasn't rage. Rage burns out too quickly. This was colder, cleaner, a decision taking shape. I put my notebook on the workbench and opened it to the page labeled System. Beneath it, I wrote one new line. Teach by experience. When the party quieted, I stepped out into the twilight. Through the kitchen window, I saw them clearing dishes. I waited until I heard the dishwasher hum and the music switch to something softer, then walked to the breaker box. I opened it slowly, touched the main switch. My thumb rested on it for a long time, just enough to feel the tremor of current. The trick with electricity is respect. You never yank, you ease. I eased 3 breakers down, living room, kitchen, dining, the furnace I left. I wasn't a monster, just a teacher. The sudden dark inside the house was almost beautiful. Through the window, candles flared to life as someone fumbled for light. I could hear voices, confusion, a laugh too high to be confident. The daughter-in-law's voice rose. "Did we blow a fuse again?" My son's reply came muffled. "It's the wiring, Dad's old setup." That made me smile. My old setup. The same one that had worked flawlessly for 40 years until they decided to update it. I walked back to the shed and sat on the edge of my cot, listening to the faint commotion fade into the distance. Within minutes, they'd retreated to their phones for light. The irony made me chuckle quietly. The power wasn't gone. It was just resting, waiting for respect. I didn't leave them long. After 20 minutes, I went back and reset the breakers. The house bloomed with light again. I watched from the yard as relief softened their faces through the window. They'd think the outage was an accident, a glitch, another old house quirk. I could live with that. Lessons that arrive quietly tend to stay longer. That night, back in the shed, I lay awake with the sound of restored electricity humming through the soil. I felt no guilt, only a steady calm. For the first time since they'd moved in, I wasn't the powerless one. I was the current under the floorboards, invisible but necessary. And they, for the first time, had felt the dark. When dawn came, I added a note to my notebook. Test successful. More to learn. The first snow of the season came quiet and mean. I could tell by the way the air bit at my lungs when I stepped outside, the kind of cold that doesn't shout, just settles into the bones and waits. The yard was white with frost that morning, each blade of grass sheathed in glass. Across the distance, my house glowed again. Their house now, at least in their minds, windows golden smoke curling from the chimney. The difference between my breath in the air and theirs behind the warmth of those walls was about 30 degrees and 3 years of misunderstanding. I poured the last of my coffee into a tin mug and warmed it over a camping burner I'd bought with cash. I'd stopped asking for favors a long time ago. There's a dignity in providing for yourself even when it's small, a warm sip of something earned. Inside the house, through the cracked curtain of the kitchen window, I saw movement. My son was standing by the counter, tapping at his phone while his wife filled a mug from the coffee maker. Ordinary scene, domestic comfort. For them, the day was beginning like any other. For me, it was the day I decided the lesson needed to begin in earnest. They'd laughed about the fuse box thing for 2 days, telling friends it was just Dad's old wiring acting up. They hadn't checked the panel, hadn't asked me a single question. When the house went dark, they'd stood in the middle of their privilege and waited for someone else to fix it. That, I decided, was the real fault line, not the wires, but the entitlement. Around 9, a light snow began to fall. I zipped my coat, crossed the yard, and stood before the breaker panel once more. The vines were stiff with ice now, their tendrils frozen around the metal door. I pried them loose carefully, like unwrapping a memory, and opened the box. The circuits waited, orderly and calm. I placed my hand against the main line, felt the faint hum travel up my palm. A living thing, invisible but absolute. Electricity is a strange teacher. It doesn't roar, it doesn't plead. It simply reminds you of presence through absence. I flipped the switches. Kitchen, living, room, bedrooms. Left the furnace alone again. I wasn't looking to freeze anyone, only to let them feel what silence means when comfort disappears. It took about 10 seconds before I heard the first voice. A startled shout from inside, then hurried footsteps. The house's hum collapsed into quiet. No fridge, no music, no laughter. I could almost hear their thoughts filling the vacuum. I turned and walked back toward the shed, my boots crunching in the snow. From the window, I watched them appear at the back door, wrapped in robes, confusion in their faces. My son stepped out onto the porch, phone in hand. He looked around the yard as if the sky itself had betrayed him. His wife followed, her voice sharp. "Not again, we just had this fixed." He muttered something, kicked at the snow, and they both went back inside. I sat down in the shed, poured the last of the coffee, and let the steam rise. It curled upward, soft and gray, while the wind pushed snow against the walls. I could still see the faint orange flicker of candles through the windows. It struck me then how beautiful that looked. Light earned honestly, not taken for granted. The hours that followed unfolded slowly. From time to time I heard doors opening, closing, the muffled thud of frustration. Once near noon, my son came out again and walked toward the panel. He stopped a few feet short, hesitated, then turned back to the house. He'd never been comfortable around the machinery of responsibility. Too many moving parts, too much that could bite back if you weren't careful. By evening, the sky had turned a dull purple. I decided it was time. I pulled on my gloves, walked out again, and reset every breaker. The click of switches sounded like punctuation to a long, unspoken sentence. A moment later, light filled the windows again. The glow spilled onto the snow, bright and almost sacred. I stood there watching it, not in triumph, but in quiet satisfaction. The kind a craftsman feels when the current runs true. I'd done nothing cruel, just reminded them that warmth is a privilege built on understanding. When I turned back toward the shed, I saw my son standing at the door watching me. He didn't say anything, maybe he couldn't. His expression was half gratitude, half realization. He must have known, even if he didn't want to admit it. I lifted a hand in a small wave, nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. Then I walked inside and closed my door. The heater in the shed hummed faintly. I'd wired it to a separate line years ago for tools that no longer mattered. I sat at my desk, opened my notebook, and wrote a single entry beneath the heading System. Power returned successfully. Observation, awareness growing. That night, sleep came easy. Maybe it was the warmth, or maybe it was knowing that somewhere in the big house across the yard they were sitting together in the glow of light they hadn't earned, thinking, perhaps for the first time, about what keeps it all alive. I didn't need an apology. I only needed them to notice the silence when I stopped speaking and to understand that the man they'd sent to the shed still knew how to turn night into day. The next morning the snow had stopped, but the world still held its breath. You could hear it in the way the air hung heavy, the way sound traveled farther when the cold pressed everything close together. From the shed I could see their footprints, two paths that met and tangled on the porch before vanishing back inside. It looked almost tender if you didn't know the story underneath. I warmed my hands around a mug of instant coffee and listened. No music today. No voices. Just the low thump of cabinet doors and the occasional scrape of a chair across the kitchen floor. They were quieter now. Careful. Silence has a way of changing people faster than lectures ever could. I spent the morning fixing a broken latch on the shed door. The screwdriver slipped once and bit my palm, a small sting that bled just enough to remind me I was still useful. Funny how pain, when it's honest, steadies you. Around noon, I heard my son call out from the back step. "Dad, you out here?" His voice carried a politeness I hadn't heard in months. I let him call twice before I opened the door. He stood there in a heavy coat, cheeks flushed from the cold, holding a small plate covered in foil. "Brought you lunch," he said, awkward like a boy bringing home a report card he wasn't sure I'd praise. I nodded, took the plate. "Thanks." He lingered, hands buried in his pockets. "Sorry about everything yesterday. We think something's wrong with the wiring again." I lifted an eyebrow. "Think so?" He shifted his weight. "Yeah. We We were wondering if maybe you could take a look." There it was, the smallest crack in the wall between us, not an apology, not yet, but an invitation to step back into the world I'd built. "I'll see what I can do after lunch," I said. He looked relieved. "Appreciate it, Dad." When he left, I sat on the cot with the plate balanced on my knees. Sandwich, chips, apple, the kind of meal you pack for someone working outside. I ate slowly, thinking how strange it felt to receive care after so much neglect. Maybe the dark had done what my words never could. In the afternoon, I walked to the house. The snow crunched underfoot, each step marking a return I hadn't planned for. Inside, the air smelled of heat and coffee. My daughter-in-law hovered by the counter, her smile tight but genuine. "Good to see you in here," she said. "We've been having some issues with the outlets." I looked around, the same walls, same photographs, but something had changed. The house felt smaller, humbled. I set my toolbox on the counter. "Show me." She led me to the hallway where the light switch had gone temperamental. I took off the faceplate, exposed the wires. "Loose neutral," I said, tightening the connection. She stood behind me, quiet. When the bulb flared back to life, she whispered, "Thank you." It was such a simple word, but it filled the room like warmth. Later, my son joined me in the kitchen. "You always made this look easy," he said. "It's easy if you respect it," I answered. He nodded, chewing on the thought, then almost shyly, "You know, we should move your things back inside. It doesn't feel right, you being out there." I looked at him for a long time, long enough for him to drop his gaze. "Not yet," I said. "Let's just keep the power running steady for a while." He smiled, small and uncertain, and changed the subject to the weather. That evening I returned to the shed, the heater humming steadily. Through the window I saw them set the table. 2 plates, no guests, no laughter beyond the walls. The house glowed softer now, like a light on a dimmer switch turned to something gentler. I realized they'd begun speaking to each other in lower tones, listening more than talking. They didn't know it, but the lesson wasn't about electricity. It was about gratitude measured in quiet acts. Silence had done what words and anger couldn't. It had reset the circuit between us. Before bed, I wrote in my notebook, "Observation. They knocked before entering the shed. Respect is returning." Then, beneath it, "Next step. Teach maintenance, not dependence." I closed the notebook and turned off the lantern. The shed went dark, but for once it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. By the time the thaw came, the world had gone soft around the edges again. The snow retreated in strips of gray and brown. The yard smelled of wet soil and wood smoke. The sharpness that winter brings had eased, and so had the sharpness in me. I woke to sunlight slipping through the cracks in the shed wall. It lit the old toolbox on the floor and the worn handle of the broom leaning against the door. The heater purred quietly, steady as a heart that had learned its rhythm again. I stretched, slow, bones creaking like settling timbers. Through the window, I could see my son dragging branches to the curb. He worked without the headphones he used to wear, just him, the rake, and the sound of crows in the distance. Inside the house, his wife was scrubbing the front windows. A simple thing, but the light bouncing off the glass looked like something being made clean again. I stepped outside, boots sinking in the damp earth, and took a long breath. The air smelled alive. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a visitor to my own home. I felt like part of the landscape again. When my son noticed me, he straightened, lifted a hand in greeting. "Morning, Dad," he called, his voice clear and easy. No edge, no embarrassment. Just the sound of a man trying to sound right. "Morning," I answered. He hesitated, then added, "Hey, we were thinking maybe you could come in for dinner tonight. We're making stew, the kind Mom used to make." That name, the one I hadn't heard in a long time, caught somewhere deep in my chest. For a second, the years folded in on themselves, her laughter in the kitchen, her hand steady on my arm as we tasted the broth together. I nodded. I'd like that. He smiled, genuine this time, then went back to work. The rest of the morning I spent checking the shed's wiring, not because it needed it, but because fixing things still made sense to me. I wiped the dust from the switches, retightened a bolt here and there. There was something comforting about order, about circuits that behaved exactly as you told them to. That evening, as the sky deepened to amber, I crossed the yard. The porch light clicked on before I reached the steps, and I realized they'd been watching for me. The door opened, warmth spilling out. My daughter-in-law stood there holding a towel, wiping her hands. She gave a small, nervous smile. "It's good to have you inside again." "Good to be here," I said. The kitchen smelled like memory, onions and beef simmering, bread toasting in the oven. My son ladled stew into bowls while she set out glasses of water. The table looked simple, honest. When we sat down, there wasn't the old noise, the showy chatter that used to fill the air. There was just the quiet clink of spoons and the hum of the heater, steady and low. After a while, my son said, "I'm sorry, Dad, for the shed, for everything. I don't even know when we stopped seeing you the way we should have." His wife looked up, eyes wet. "We were selfish. We thought we were helping, but we made it about us." I let their words settle. I'd imagined this moment 100 different ways. Angry, dramatic, maybe even tearful. But sitting there, the apology felt simple, like a breaker finally flipping back into place. "I know," I said quietly. "You were learning. Sometimes people have to lose the light before they notice the dark." We ate in silence after that, but it was a good silence, the kind that fills rather than empties. When dinner was done, I stood and walked to the old fuse box in the hallway. The cover was dusty, fingerprints smudged across the metal. I opened it, checked the rows of switches, everything neat, labeled, alive. My handwriting still there, faded but holding. "House is in good shape," I said. My son stood beside me. "Yeah, because you built it right." Later, before bed, I packed up the few things I'd kept in the shed, a blanket, a mug, the notebook full of observations. I left the heater humming. Someone might still use that space one day, but not as exile, not as punishment. I locked the door, slipped the key into my pocket, and walked toward the porch light. Inside, the house felt different, lighter somehow, though nothing physical had changed. Maybe it was me. Maybe it was them. Maybe it was the current between us flowing the way it was always, meant to. That night, lying in my own bed for the first time in months, I listened to the house breathe. The creaks, the soft whir of the fridge, the faint whistle of wind against the siding. It all sounded like forgiveness. When sleep came, it came without resistance. The mornings have gone still again, but not in the lonely way they used to. Now it's the quiet of a house breathing easy, the kind that comes when every circuit hums the way it should. The shed stands out back, door closed, heater unplugged, just part of the yard again. From my kitchen window I can see it at dawn, the frost melting off its roof as the first light hits. Funny how something that once felt like exile can turn into a monument, a reminder that respect, once rebuilt, stands sturdier than anger ever could. I wake early out of habit. Old electricians never sleep in. We trust the light best when we see it arrive. The coffee pot gurgles in the corner, the same one I wired a new outlet for decades ago. The smell fills the kitchen. My son is already outside, shoveling the walk before work. He waves through the window and I nod back. No words, just a rhythm we've found again. His wife hums in the living room, folding laundry, the small sounds of an ordinary life mended. The house feels like itself again, balanced, grounded. You can tell when a home has forgiven its occupants. The walls stop echoing, the floors stop groaning, even the air moves different, like it trusts you to keep it warm. After breakfast, I pull my chair closer to the window. The light today is gold, soft, not the cold white of the months in the shed. I sip slowly and think about how easily comfort turns invisible until it's gone. That's the truth about power. Not the kind that runs through wires, but the kind we give each other. You don't notice it's flowing until someone cuts the line. Last night after dinner, my son handed me something. A small metal tag, cleaned and polished. It used to hang on the breaker box. Installed by Torres Electrical, 1974. I'd taken it down years ago when I retired, thinking nobody cared who'd built what. But he'd found it in the garage, wiped it clean, and pressed it into my palm. "You should put this back," he'd said. "It's yours." I didn't have words then, and I still don't. I just set the tag on the table beside my coffee mug and look at it now, catching the light. My name, or at least the mark of who I used to be, reflects in the metal. For the first time in a long while, I don't feel like the past is something I left behind. It's something I carried home. Around noon, the three of us eat lunch together, simple soup, bread from the bakery down the street. We don't fill the air with apologies or explanations. That's the thing about reconciliation. It doesn't need a speech, only steady proof. My son asks about an old radio he found in the attic. "Think it still works?" he says. "Everything works. Tell him, if you know where the power runs." He laughs, and for once it sounds young again. When they leave for errands, I wander the house. My wife's photo still sits on the mantel, same frame, same smile. I touch the corner gently. "You'd like the way it sounds in here now," I whisper. Maybe she hears, maybe not. Either way, it feels right to say it. In the afternoon, I go out to the shed one last time. The air inside smells faintly of sawdust and dusted copper. I run my hand over the workbench, the grain of the wood. I pick up my old notebook, the one filled with dates, notes, and reminders of nights I thought would never end, and slide it into a drawer. The story doesn't need more pages, it's already told. Back inside, I make fresh coffee and sit on the porch as the sun lowers behind the trees. The sky turns the same color as warm metal. From here, I can see light spilling through every window of the house, steady and even. The hum beneath the floorboards is gentle, balanced current, proper load. That's what I used to call it in my work. A system in harmony. And that's what it feels like now, not victory, not revenge, just restoration. The current flowing right where it belongs. The house is bright, my family is learning, and I'm home again where the warmth returns, not as a gift, but as something we rebuilt together. If you felt something in this story, take a moment to like the video. It really helps us keep sharing these life stories with you. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to teach someone a hard lesson? Not with anger, but with silence. I read every comment, and your stories matter here. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and take care of your light.